This is Moscow. Return to the World Service of the Voice of Russia.
The news read by Esther Winters. First, the headlines. According to estimates, the Russian Communist Party and the pro-government unity bloc are leading in the results of the parliamentary elections held on Sunday in Russia. Russian President Boris Yeltsin has said Moscow and Beijing are determined to oppose all attempts to impose on a monopolar world. At least 10,000 people were killed as a result of floods and mudslides in Venezuela. Those were the headlines, and now the news in full. As vote counting continued on Monday night, after Sunday's parliamentary elections in Russia, the reports issued by the Central Electoral Commission showed that the Communists are maintaining the lead with about 24.2% of the vote. Coming next was the pro-government unity bloc with 23.3% of the vote. And the Fatherland of Russia movement with 12.6%. The Right-Wing Forces Union was placed fourth with 8.7%. And fifth place was shared by the Zhirinovsky bloc and the Yabloko party with more than 6% each. Thus, only 6 out of the 26 parties and election blocs on the ballot sheet cleared the 5% barrier necessary to enter the lower house of the Russian Parliament, the State Duma. With allowance made for single-mandate constituencies, the Communists could get more than about 110 seats in the 450-seat State Duma. Unity may hope for 76 seats, and the Fatherland or Russia a little less than 62. The Right-Wing Forces Union 29 seats, and Yabloko 22. The Zhirinovsky bloc will probably get only 17 seats. Independent seats could be about 105. The Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin believes that the recent elections have confirmed that his country is facing political stabilization, a very important stage in its development. This is what he said on Monday, talking by telephone with the British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Prime Minister Putin has also said that the recent elections can be assessed as a victory of the current cabinet's policy. The British Prime Minister Tony Blair noted that the elections in Russia have been held in compliance with democratic standards. He's of the opinion that the renewed State Duma is likely to work constructively with the Russian government. Mr. Putin has confirmed that an invitation to visit Russia given to Tony Blair is still in force. For his part, the British Prime Minister has invited his Russian counterpart to make an official visit to London. Hilly Dine, the president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, who headed the OSCE observation mission at the elections to the Russian State Duma, has given a positive assessment of the voting procedure. At a press conference held in the Russian capital on Monday, she mentioned no serious violations. The elections were held in the atmosphere of competitiveness and pluralism, which confirms that Russia has made a step forward in its democratic development, emphasized the president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. At the same time, she says that foreign observers are seriously concerned over the flow of slander that the participants in the election battle spread in the mass media. A record number of foreign observers, nearly 1,200, were in Russia monitoring the parliamentary elections. The leader of the Russian Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, voiced readiness to cooperate with other parties in the State Duma, above all with the Fatherland or Russia bloc. At the same time, he said cooperation with the Zhirinovsky bloc and the right-wing forces union was unacceptable for communists. The governor of St. Petersburg and one of Fatherland All Russia's leaders, Vladimir Yakovlev, also came out for constructive cooperation with all parties and movements in the lower house of the Russian parliament. Meanwhile, the head of the Unity bloc, Minister of Emergencies, Sergei Shoigu, is still uncertain whether to enter the State Duma or remain in office. A Russian military spokesperson announced on Monday that more Russian paratroopers were being moved into mountain regions in southern Chechnya from neighboring Dagestan. On Saturday night, an advance force landed on mountains overlooking the Sharoy region and blocked two strategic roads leading to Georgia, therefore cutting off the remaining supply routes the rebels used to bring in ammunition and reinforcements. Chechen President Aslan Maskhadov knows all about hostage cases, it seems, in Chechnya and receives his share of the ransom. This was announced by Ralph Sinalov, a resident of the Azeri capital Baku, one of the recently freed hostages. He told a news conference on Monday that Maskhadov's representative had visited him and two other captives during their 7-month detention in a cellar. The kidnappers were beaten, starved and tortured. At first, the bandits demanded $3 million for his release. Later, the ransom was slashed to $40,000. And a reminder at this stage, you're tuned to Voice of Russia World Service. This is the news. Russia and China are full of determination to resist attempts by some countries to create a one-polar world. In an interview with the Chinese television and the official Xinhua news agency, Russian President Boris Yeltsin said that Moscow and Beijing would campaign for a multipolar world and wage a joint battle against terrorism and separatism. The Russian President expressed satisfaction with the results of his visit to China earlier this month and thanked the Chinese leaders for supporting Russia on the issue of Chechnya. He hailed the return of Macau back under Chinese sovereignty, a move he described as a landmark step forward towards the unification of China. The Russian President Boris Yeltsin also said that Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin would pay a visit to China in the first half of the year 2000. And a reminder at this stage, you're tuned to Voice of Russia World Service. You're listening to the news. On Monday, the NATO-headed KFOR units arrested in Banja Luka the Bosnian Serb General Stanislav Delic. This news was broken by the Bosnian Serb television. During the war in Bosnia, in the period between 1992 and 1995, General Galic was in command of one of the Bosnian Serb corps. At present, he is an advisor to the Bosnian Serb president for military issues. He is not mentioned on the official list among those persons who are declared by the International Hague Tribunal for former Yugoslavia as wanted. However, it is apparent that the tribunal has a secret list. Only Syria and Lebanon together will sign a peace treaty with Israel. This is what the Syrian Foreign Minister Farak al-Sharar said on Monday, commenting on the Syrian-Israeli peace talks that started in Washington last week after a break of 4 years. He emphasized that Lebanon won't take part in the next round of negotiations due to take place on January the 3rd, but that it will join the peace process shortly after January the 3rd. Israelis and Palestinians have failed to overcome certain differences on the key issues at the regular round of peace talks that were held in Ramallah on the West Bank on Monday. According to the Palestinians' official representatives, the Israelis have refused to stop the construction of new settlements on its territories occupied by their troops in an attempt to reclaim the borders. The statement of the Palestinian Ministry of Information notes that the main objective of the talks is the implementation of the 2 resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. providing for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the territories that they occupied, their old positions on the border that existed before 1967. At least 10,000 people were killed as a result of floods and mudslides in the north and northwest of Venezuela. This figure was given to Reuters by the Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jose Vicente Langal on Monday. To end the news, the headlines once again. According to estimates, the Russian Communist Party and the pro-government Unity Bloc are leading in the results of the parliamentary elections held on Sunday in Russia. And the Russian President Boris Yeltsin has said Moscow and Beijing are determined to oppose all attempts to impose on them a monopolar world. And with the repetition of those headlines, we end the news.
In the Voice of Russia World Service, this is News and Views. In this edition, Russia's President Boris Yeltsin has given an interview to the Chinese television and Xinhua news agency. New developments around Chechnya. Stay tuned for this and more in this edition of News and Views. Russia's President Boris Yeltsin has given an interview to the Chinese television and Xinhua news agency, paying particular attention to bilateral relations. At first, touching on the return to China of the Portuguese enclave Macau, Almin, Boris Yeltsin said that Russia is welcoming the restoration of China's sovereignty over Macau. He believes that this event is a new important landmark on the way of realization by the Chinese leadership of its top priority national task, the unification of the country. Asked how he assesses his recent unofficial meeting with China's President Jiang Zemin, Boris Yeltsin emphasized that he is completely satisfied with the results. In his opinion, the Beijing summit is an important step forward in the deepening of particular cooperation between the two powers. We have confirmed that we are ready to jointly work in order to speed up the forming of the multipolar world and also to oppose all attempts to impose a monopolar world order on the international community, he said. Russia and China are in full agreement on the whole package of issues dealing with the maintenance of strategic stability in the world. That's why Russia's president has found it necessary to broaden interaction between the two countries in this sphere. Besides, Boris Yeltsin has noted that of particular importance are his agreements with Jiang Zemin on the necessity to resist all attempts to weaken the role of the United Nations and its Security Council, and to belittle the significance of the international law standards. Boris Yeltsin has said that Russia and China will jointly defend their coordinated positions on acute international problems and also combat international terrorism, separatism, and other forms of extremism. Therefore, the President has again emphasized that he is giving a high appraisal of China's support of the actions taken by the Russian federal authorities in Chechnya. In an interview for the Chinese television and Xinhua news agency, Boris Yeltsin mentioned that great progress has been made in Beijing and the strengthening of bilateral relations as well. And finally, the last chapter has been closed in the demarcation of coordinated sectors of the Russian-Chinese border, and another important circumstance. After the signing of an unprecedented agreement on the joint economic exploitation of separate islands and border rivers, the local residents were given the right to continue, within a 5-year period, their economic activities on the islands that, as a result of the demarcation, changed their owners. Boris Yeltsin believes that the results of the Beijing summit have proved that an equal and confident strategic partnership between Russia and China is an accomplished fact. The President has said that in the first half of the year 2000, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin will go to China to continue discussing with the Chinese leadership the whole range of bilateral economic relations. In Saturday's elections, Russia voted in a new State Duma, the lower house of its parliament. Our commentary is by Galina Grozeva. The sensation of Sunday's elections is that for the first time, pro-government and reformist groups secured a majority, unprecedented for post-Soviet Russia, at least according to early reports. The official will be released just before New Year's. For years, the legislative and executive branches of government have been at loggerheads, and political crises have followed one after another. Now the grounds for confrontation should be minimal. Russia will finally be able to create close-knit political machinery that, along with political stability, will ensure a considerable advance in market reforms and an end to the remnants of communism in society. The new lower house of parliament will apparently have 6 political factions instead of 4, and only one will be left-wing, the communist. The other 5 are right-wing, right-of-center, and centrist. These include the new pro-government bloc Unity, led by the Minister for Emergency Situations, Sergei Shoigu, and the Union of Right-Wing Forces, led by the former Prime Minister, Sergei Kiriyenko. The success of these 2 are the main sensation of Sunday's elections. The centrist Fatherland All-Russia bloc, led by the former Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov and Moscow Mayor Yuri Lushkov, is also in the new Duma, though it polled fewer votes than expected, which is another sensation of the elections. And so are the Liberal Democratic Party under Vladimir Zhirinovsky and the Yabloko Party led by Grigory Yavlinsky, both strongly anti-communist parties. For this reason, some experts are talking of the final victory of capitalism in Russia. They may be right. With a pronounced reformist majority, the new Duma will be able to block the left and put through the laws the government and president need. For example, a law opening land to purchase and sale. Also, final confirmation of a new tax system, ratification of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START II, and ratification of economic treaties based on a product-sharing law. The new lower house will also be able to block any attempts of the left to voice no confidence in the government. There is another important outcome of Sunday's vote, namely, Russia's right-wing liberal groups have returned to power for good, since they now have an impressive social basis in private enterprise. Furthermore, since Prime Minister Vladimir Putin supported the Unity Bloc and the Union of Right-Wing Forces, and these 2 polled a far greater number of votes than the boldest forecasters promised, the outcome of the vote may be seen as a major victory for Mr. Putin, which helps well for his chances in the presidential elections next June. The Prime Minister unquestionably owes this victory to his principled stand on the struggle against international terrorism in Chechnya, and to the fact his cabinet has brought about stable growth in the Russian economy. Comment was by Galina Grozeva.
Tens of thousands of observers from parties and election blocs were supervising Sunday's elections to the lower house of the Russian Parliament, the State Duma. Helping them were observers from the international mission comprising a number of European organizations. Valery Platonov has compiled the following. The international mission to supervise the December 19th elections to the Russian State Duma was set up by the parliamentary assemblies of the OSCE and the Council of Europe, the European Parliament, and the Bureau of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. The mission's statement, issued on Monday, says the polls revealed that Russia had made essential progress along the path of democracy. The head of a team of foreign observers and a chairperson of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Hella Dine, said this.
Not everything has been perfect, as we have pointed it out, but taking all things into consideration, this has been a good election, and we hope the results will be good for the people of this country. In conclusion, let me say that I believe this election process will strengthen the Duma as one of the most important democratic institutions in this country.
Said the head of a team of foreign observers and chairperson of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, Hella Dine. Meanwhile, the chief observer from the Council of Europe, And its vice chairperson, Ernst Mullermann, who had supervised several previous polls, had this to say.
I observe since many years all the election in Russia. And I can say, as Vice Chairman of the Council of Europe, Russia maintains its democratic course. We visit polling stations in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kursk, Krasnoyarsk, Cheboskary, Rostov, and Vladivostok. For me, this was the best cooperation between international organizations during many years.
Said the chief observer from the Council of Europe, its vice chairperson, Ernst Mullermann. Among the main drawbacks of the elections, the mission is no doubt the soft attitude of the Central Electoral Commission to violations connected with campaign funding. And it also noted that the media covering the campaign were too politicized, and that some officials combined political activities with their formal duties. An item compiled by Valery Platonov. In the opinion of news analyst Edward Ryabtsev, the anti-terrorist operation in Chechnya is coming to a close, and here are the points he makes. President Yeltsin expects the problem to be settled before his term of office expires, which will happen next June. In fact, the federal troops have been ridding Chechnya of bandits and terrorists so effectively that their total defeat may take place in a month or two. Then all efforts can be switched to rebuilding the republic. On Sunday, the federal troops found key roads leading to Georgia and thereby blocked the mountainous part of Chechnya, the very area, according to the military, which was serving as a conduit for mercenaries and weapons from other countries. The Russian Chief of Staff General Anatoly Kvashnin is quoted as saying that federal troops have surrounded the main terrorist bases in the mountains. As a result of closing in on the city in the past 2 days, the federal troops have entered the northern and southern parts of the city. The humanitarian corridors for civilians are still open, and several hundred more people have left in these 2 days. What indicates a turning point in the situation, as much as anything, is the steady stream of hundreds of Chechen men volunteering to act together with the federal troops against the terrorists. General Gennady Troshev, who commands the eastern group of troops, insists that these volunteers must themselves rid their republic of terrorists. With all this happening, the government representative in the North Caucasus, Vice Premier Nikolai Koshman, believes that next June the people of Chechnya will be able to vote in Russia's presidential election and also to choose their representatives for the State Duma. The commentary has been prepared by Edward Ryabtsev. During NATO's recent foreign ministerial meeting in Brussels, Washington's European partners openly frowned on its declared intention to deploy a nationwide missile defense system. Alexander Druzhinin has more. The critics of the American plan accuse Washington of using double standards on security matters, where one of the members of the Western Defense Alliance is going to be better protected than the rest. It looks like hiding behind its missile defense system, the economically and militarily more powerful United States is giving its Western European partners a chance to decide for themselves what they are going to do with their own anti-missile defenses. If that's what the White House is really doing, then chances are pretty high that some of its European allies may start setting up their own missile defense systems, thus forcing the rest to follow suit, and resulting in a very dangerous and economically draining spread of the nuclear arms race across the continent. This will also seriously antagonize Russia, which is vehemently opposed to any attempts to deploy missile defenses not provided by the 1972 ABM Treaty. And with a good reason, too, because Russia will have to develop weapons able to crack open the Europeans' anti-missile defenses, which is very bad for European security. It seems like Washington couldn't care less about European security and the whole world, and that the so-called North Atlantic solidarity ends exactly where America's selfish interests begin. The commentary was by Alexander Dorjigin.
Plutonium is, of course, a chemical element, but one that doesn't occur naturally and is created in nuclear reactors. It was first produced for military purposes as the stuff of nuclear bombs. In the Soviet Union, it was first produced in 1949, a few months before the first successful test of an atom bomb in this country. Both Russia and the United States have large stockpiles of plutonium. It comes mainly from the 15,000 or so nuclear warheads that the two countries undertook to dismantle under the nuclear disarmament treaties they have signed. Russia also extracts plutonium from its spent nuclear fuel. Its nuclear power industry is run according to what is called a closed circle. Both countries acknowledge that they have a problem of somehow disposing of excess weapons-grade plutonium in a manner that would rule out any possibility of its falling into the hands of, say, terrorist groups. This presents significant challenges, as was stated in London 3 months ago by the Russian Minister of Atomic Energy, Joe Adamov, and the United States Undersecretary for Energy, Ernest Moniz. They were speaking at the 24th Annual Symposium of the Uranium Institute. However, it now seems there is an element of divergence in the plans of the two countries in this field. Russian experts believe, as does the international scientific community, that the excess weapons-grade plutonium in the world should be used in the nuclear power industry. It is, after all, an excellent nuclear fuel. In fact, the Russian Academy of Sciences signed a special agreement in March with the United States Department of Energy on joint work to solve the scientific and technical problems involved in this and related problems of the atomic power industry. The agreement was signed by the then president of the Academy, Nikolai Lavrov, and the Energy Secretary, Bill Richardson. It was the first wide-ranging agreement on cooperation concluded by the two bodies. The hope was expressed that Russia and the United States would, in the next few years, work out a common approach to more detailed aspects of cooperation in this and related fields. Russian experts are convinced that the optimal use for plutonium is in the nuclear power industry, and they are studying the types of reactors where plutonium could be burned most efficiently. The moves in the United States Congress to develop plutonium warheads of a new generation introduce a discordant note into the idea of fruitful cooperation between the two countries on the plutonium problem, coming as they do in the wake of moves that could torpedo the landmark anti-ballistic missile treaty. They could have dangerous consequences. They could, in fact, refuel the arms race between the two countries. And that would be deplorable. Plutonium is a product of the human genius, and it should be used accordingly.
And there we end this edition of News and Views. From Voice of Russia World Service, this is the news in brief. As vote counting continued on Monday night after Sunday's parliamentary polls in Russia, the reports issued by the Central Electoral Commission showed that the Communists maintained the lead with about 24.2% of the vote. Coming next were the pro-government unity bloc with about 23.3%. Russia and China are full of determination to resist attempts by some countries to create a one-polar world. In an interview with the Chinese television and the official Xinhua news agency, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin said that Moscow and Beijing would campaign for a multipolar world and wage a joint battle against terrorism and separatism. At least 10,000 people were killed as a result of floods and mudslides in Venezuela. The leader of the Russian Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, voiced readiness to cooperate with other parties in the new State Duma, above all with the Fatherland All-Russia bloc. The president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, who headed the OSCE observer mission at the elections to the State Duma, has given a positive assessment of the voting procedure. And that was news in brief.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia World Service. I'm Michael Chernik with another edition of the 20th Century, Year After Year historical series prepared by Vladimir Zhamkin. The year 1947. In our previous program, we talked about the roots of the Cold War between Russia and the United States. The confrontation was set off by the speech Winston Churchill made at Fulton, Missouri, on March 5th, 1946. A year later, U.S. President Harry Truman unveiled his doctrine regarding relations with the Soviet Union as a global rivalry. For nearly 45 years, until its demise caused by the Soviet collapse on December 8, 1991, the Cold War never once degenerated into a full-scale confrontation, even though the two sides prepared for war, building up their military muscle and challenging each other in every part of the globe. As a result, Russia and the United States have stockpiled enough weapons to destroy all life on Earth many times over. And still, neither side ever dared to use its deadly might against the other. How come? Initially, neither Russia nor the United States really wanted to fight. When the confrontation became a hard fact, neither country was 100% sure it would win if a nuclear war actually broke out. This uncertainty fueled the superpowers' desire to perfect their arsenals to obtain an additional edge over each other. The emerging Cold War split the whole world into two rival military, political, and economic blocs, two political systems. It was a bipolar world now governed by a simple logic, where countries were either friends or foes. One result of that global confrontation in Russia was the campaign against the so-called cosmopolitans. That is, anyone taking interest in Western literature, music, and art. It culturally isolated the Soviet people from the rest of the world. Always eager to minimize his people's contacts with the West, Joseph Stalin banned all marriages with foreigners. On June 5th, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall called for urgent economic assistance to strengthen the European democracies. The Soviet Union saw it as an American attempt to economically enslave Europe and pressured its Eastern European allies to reject the Marshall Plan. The United States established the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Czechoslovak capital Prague hosted the first World Youth Festival for peace and friendship between peoples. In Israel, archaeologists unearthed a trove of ancient scrolls, including copies of the Old Testament, written 1,000 years before the oldest ones existing to date. The scrolls once belonged to a monastic commune dispersed by the Romans. Also, in 1947, they found and published the famous Anne Frank diary. When the Jewish girl was 4, her family moved from Germany to the Netherlands, away from Nazi anti-Semitism. When the Germans occupied Amsterdam, Anne's family was hiding in a local friend's house. Someone tipped off the secret police, and Anne, her parents and relatives wound up in a death camp, where she died not living to celebrate her 16th birthday. Her diary later served as a material for a play, and was also put on film, depicting the terrible suffering millions of people went through under Nazism. 1947 is the birth year of the famous American movie director, author, and producer Steven Spielberg, whose Jaws and Jurassic Park blockbusters have packed movie theaters all around the world. Schindler's List, Spielberg's first Oscar-winning effort, brings up the painful subject of the Holocaust. Another prominent newborn of the year was the great Spanish opera singer, José Carreras, whose repertoire spans the distance from Georg Handel to Leonard Bernstein. Partnering with the equally outstanding tenors Placido Domingo and Luciano Pavarotti, he recorded the very best arias. In 1947, the famous Norwegian scientist Thor Heyerdahl crossed the oceans on board Kon-Tiki, a flimsy-looking reed replica of an ancient Peruvian boat. And there we end another edition of the 20th Century Year After Year series written by Vladimir Zhamkin. Until the year 1948. Goodbye.
You're tuned to the Voice of Russia World Service.
We present Old Russian Waltzes as sung by a soloist of the Bolshoi Theater, Nina Terentьева.
In the World Service of the Voice of Russia, we featured old Russian waltzes as sung by Nina Terentьева.
This is the Voice of Russia World Service. The preliminary results of the elections to the State Duma, the lower house of parliament, that took place on December the 19th and that are published in the press, are widely discussed in public and political circles and mass media. This topic was the focus of the discussion of our commentator Vitaly Glazunov with politologist, deputy director of the Institute of the USA and Canada Studies of the Academy of Sciences, Viktor Kremenuk.
Mr. Kremenuk, first of all, thank you very much for participation in the program of the Voice of Russia State Radio Broadcasting Company. Although the final figures are not published yet, it is evident that the elections to the State Duma are here. So what would be your commentary on the first results of the elections?
Well, I think that it's very important to underline several things. First of them is that we witness the process of continuing fight between different groups of the Russian political parties or political leads. And the purpose is, of course, the presidency. I don't think that really the position of the Duma matters that much. Because the Duma is weak, doesn't decide anything, so it was simply a rehearsal before the fight for presidency next June. Second, the authorities, or what we call the part of the government, has used this opportunity in order to consolidate its positions. And it has managed. And disregarding the tremendous opposition which exists in the country among the people who are dissatisfied with their position, who are not happy with the policy of the authorities, still they have managed. And one of the explanations, of course, that the most creative means were used first to against their rivals, and second, of course, to propagate among the people their ideas which helped them to consolidate. One of them, of course, war in Chechnya, and which is popular and which is regarded, as a final resolution of the government to do something. Third, still, unfortunately, in the Russian political spectrum, we see two strong opposition groups. On one hand, the party of the government, on the other hand, the party of the communists. What Mr. Primakov and Lushkov hope to do that is to fill the gap between the two branches by creating something like a centrist force. It has happened, but not to the extent which the people hope. So now again we have these two strong wings which will continue to fight each other both in the Duma and outside the Duma. And as one may hope or expect that during the presidential election, of course, the two first candidates which will get the majority of the votes, would be a representative of the government and a representative of the communists. So that the Russians would be forced again to choose between the two evils, the current corrupted government or the communists.
How can you explain the tremendous success of the Medved, the bear governmental movement? It was created a month before the elections, but now it is a leader of the election campaign.
Oh, it's so easy to explain. Corruption which dominates the Russian political process, which has the basis of it was very simple, and some of the innocent people in the Medved were revealing it publicly that the government is promising the donations and dotations to those areas and to the leaders of those areas which would support Medved. And the local leaders were trying to do their job, and it's so understandable. So I don't think that it really reflects the position of the people. Basically, the people are very, disappointed and indifferent towards that. It simply reflects the extent of the corruption and the extent of the possibility of many to manipulate the outcome of voting by the local authorities.
The ex-president Mikhail Gorbachev said in an interview with the NTV that these elections were dirtiest he saw in his life. First of all, I think he meant the struggle you mentioned is about the pro-governmental political movement and the public movement, Fatherland of Russia, headed by Moscow Mailbag and Mr. Primakov. And certainly, I completely agree with you that Fatherland of Russia were the losers in this struggle.
Losers are not, it's hard to say, because yes, many people expected that they would win much more. Why? Because when that group has appeared, I think it was in August, or somewhere for a few months ago, their chances were much higher, or expectations were much higher than the real outcome. But anyway, there will be a central group in the parliament, and that's already something, especially if to keep in mind, the extent to which the government was using all the means, including dirty and non-dirty, in order to fight these groups, but nevertheless they have won, and they have more than 10% of the vote. So they will have their faction in the parliament, and they may play a very useful role in forging something like leftist center, maybe starting with the center and then to the left. Yabloko, maybe the communists, or some elements at least the communists, so to mobilize that part of the political spectrum which is definitely non-governmental, anti-governmental, and may help in preventing the abuse of the power by the authorities.
Now it's quite clear that 6 political parties or blocks will compose the new State Duma. Among those are, you mentioned already, the BIA, then the Fatherland of Russia, then communists, then Zhirinovsky political bloc, then the Union of Right Forces, and the Yabloko public movement. In your point of view as a specialist, what might be the coalitions between those groups?
Well, one of the coalitions is clear, the pro-governmental coalition, and different we have already some confirmations of that strategy. That is the Union of Right Forces and the Zhirinovsky. They have declared that they will form a pro-governmental coalition. But in just if to try to calculate what amount that they have, that will be around half of the deputies, but not the majority. So if to speak about the possibilities of the opposition to the government, or if the opposition forms something like coalition, a permanent coalition, or temporarily on some certain specific issues, so they will have something like almost equal half of the parliament. So I feel The government, while seeking for its purposes, has simply perpetuated, this swing of the pendulum between the different extremities in the Russian political life. It has ignored or disregarded the necessity to create a strong centrist coalition in order to stabilize the situation in the society. It's again an evidence that the government doesn't wish a stability in the society. A stability in the society would be the end of this corrupted regime. Because if the stability in the society appears, that means that, there will be some law start working and all the mechanisms start working, so that would really just limit the possibilities to steal. So the government has done everything to avoid stabilization of the society. It is not interested in that. It is interested in consolidation some power. Yes, it has gained something in that. It is interested in continuation of this two major opposition blocks, I say, communists versus the government. Yes, it has managed in doing that. So that means that we shall witness further continuation of the struggle between the two branches of the political spectrum, and maybe at one point the communists will win again.
The very strong governmental coalition, you mentioned about it, will play a positive role for Mr. Putin as a premier. He will keep his position after the presidential elections. He has nominated himself already as a candidate. And it will be very easy for him to go up to the presidential chair. Am I right?
Well, maybe. But that will mean only one thing, that the war in Chechnya will continue, because without the war in Chechnya, Mr. Putin has nothing to present to the voters. He has done nothing in the area of economy, has done nothing in the area of social relations. War in Chechnya and seduction of the regional leaders. That's all the things which he has done. That's too insignificant, to hope to get the positive vote. But nevertheless, you will have to exploit these two things, which means, on one hand, that unfortunately for the poor Chechens, the war will continue probably until June. Simply the rate of the Russian advance, of the Russian forces would be a bit slowed, so that, by June there will be something like decisive victory.
Mr. Kremenyuk, thank you very much for an interview.
That was a discussion of our commentator Vitaly Glazunov with politologist, Deputy Director of the Institute of USA and Canada Studies of the Academy of Sciences, Viktor Kremenyuk.
This is the World Service of the Voice of Russia. At 05 hours UTC, we are opening transmissions to Asia in the 41-meter band short waves. We continue broadcasting to North America in the 16, 19, 25, and 41-meter band shortwaves, and also on 194 meters in the medium waves. Listeners in Europe can hear us on 433 meters in the medium waves. This is Moscow. You're tuned to the World Service of the Voice of Russia.
The news read by Star Winters. First, the headlines. According to estimates, the Russian Communist Party and the pro-government Unity Bloc are leading in the results of the parliamentary elections held on Sunday in Russia. Russian President Boris Yeltsin has said Moscow and Beijing are determined to oppose all attempts to impose on them a monopolar world. At least 10,000 people were killed as a result of floods and mudslides in Venezuela. These were headlines, and now the news in full. As vote counting continued on Monday night, after Sunday's parliamentary elections in Russia, the reports issued by the Central Electoral Commission showed that the Communists are maintaining the lead with about 24.2% of the vote. Coming next was the pro-government Unity Bloc with 23.3% of the vote. And the Fatherland or Russia movement with 12.6%. The Right-Wing Forces Union was placed fourth with 8.7%. And fifth place was shared by the Zhirinovsky Bloc and the Yabloko Party with more than 6% each. Thus, only 6 out of the 26 parties and election blocks on the ballot sheet cleared the 5% barrier necessary to enter the lower house of the Russian parliament, the State Duma. With allowance made for single-mandate constituencies, the Communists could get more than about 110 seats in the 450-seat State Duma. Unity may hope for 76 seats, and the Fatherland or Russia a little less than 62. The Right-Wing Forces Union, 29 seats, and Yabloko, 22. The Zhirinovsky Bloc will probably get only 17 seats. Independent seats could be about 105. The Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin believes that the recent elections have confirmed that his country is facing political stabilization, a very important stage in its development. This is what he said on Monday, talking by telephone with the British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Prime Minister Putin has also said that the recent elections can be assessed as a victory of the current cabinet's policy. The British Prime Minister Tony Blair noted that the elections in Russia have been held in compliance with democratic standards. He's of the opinion that the renewed State Duma is likely to work constructively with the Russian government. Mr. Putin has confirmed that an invitation to visit Russia given to Tony Blair is still in force. For his part, the British Prime Minister has invited his Russian counterpart to make an official visit to London. Heli Dine, the president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, who headed the OSCE observation mission at the elections to the Russian State Duma, has given a positive assessment of the voting procedure. At a press conference held in the Russian capital on Monday, she mentioned no serious violations. The elections were held in the atmosphere of competitiveness and pluralism, which confirms that Russia has made a step forward in its democratic development, emphasized the president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. At the same time, she said that foreign observers are seriously concerned over the flow of slander that the participants in the election battle spread in the mass media. A record number of foreign observers, nearly 1,200, were in Russia monitoring the parliamentary elections. The leader of the Russian Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, voiced readiness to cooperate with other parties in the State Duma, above all with the Fatherland or Russia bloc. At the same time, he said cooperation with the Zhirinovsky bloc and the right-wing forces union was unacceptable for communists. The governor of St. Petersburg and one of Fatherland All Russia's leaders, Vladimir Yakovlev, also came out for constructive cooperation with all parties and movements in the lower house of the Russian parliament. Meanwhile, the head of the Unity bloc, Minister of Emergencies, Sergei Shoigu, is still uncertain whether to enter the State Duma or remain in office. A Russian military spokesperson announced on Monday that more Russian paratroopers were being moved into mountain regions in southern Chechnya from neighboring Dagestan. On Saturday night, an advance force landed on mountains overlooking the Sharoy region and blocked two strategic roads leading to Georgia, therefore cutting off the remaining supply routes the rebels used to bring in ammunition and reinforcements. Chechen President Aslam Maskhadov knows all about hostage cases, it seems, in Chechnya and receives his share of the ransom. This was announced by Raif Sinalov, a resident of the Azeri capital Baku, one of the recently freed hostages. He told a news conference on Monday that Maskhadov's representative had visited him and two other captives during their 7-month detention in a cellar. The kidnappers were beaten, starved and tortured. At first, the bandits demanded $3 million for his release. Later, the ransom was slashed to $40,000. And a reminder at this stage, you're tuned to Voice of Russia World Service. This is the news. Russia and China are full of determination to resist attempts by some countries to create a one-polar world. In an interview with the Chinese television and the official Xinhua news agency, Russian President Boris Yeltsin said that Moscow and Beijing would campaign for a multipolar world and wage a joint battle against terrorism and separatism. The Russian President expressed satisfaction with the results of his visit to China earlier this month and thanked the Chinese leaders for supporting Russia on the issue of Chechnya. He hailed the return of Macau back under Chinese sovereignty, a move he described as a landmark step forward towards the unification of China. The Russian President Boris Yeltsin also said that the Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin would pay a visit to China in the first half of the year 2000. And a reminder at this stage, you're tuned to Voice of Russia World Service. You're listening to the news. On Monday, the NATO-headed K4 units arrested in Banja Luka the Bosnian Serb General Stanislav Galic. This news was broken by the Bosnian Serb television. During the war in Bosnia, in the period between 1992 and 1995, General Galic was in command of one of the Bosnian Serb corps. At present, he is an advisor to the Bosnian Serb president for military issues. He is not mentioned on the official list among those persons who are declared by the International Hague Tribunal for former Yugoslavia as wanted. However, it is apparent that the tribunal has a secret list. Only Syria and Lebanon together will sign a peace treaty with Israel. This is what the Syrian Foreign Minister Farak al-Sharar said on Monday, commenting on the Syrian-Israeli peace talks that started in Washington last week after a break of 4 years. He emphasized that Lebanon won't take part in the next round of negotiations due to take place on January the 3rd, but that it will join the peace process shortly after January the 3rd. Israelis and Palestinians have failed to overcome certain differences on the key issues of the regular round of peace talks that were held in Ramallah on the West Bank on Monday. According to the Palestinians' official representatives, the Israelis have refused to stop the construction of new settlements on its territories occupied by their troops in an attempt to recarve the borders. The statement of the Palestinian Ministry of Information notes that the main objective of the talks is the implementation of the 2 resolutions of the United Nations Security Council. providing for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the territories that they occupied, their old positions on the border that existed before 1967. At least 10,000 people were killed as a result of floods and mudslides in the north and northwest of Venezuela. This figure was given to Reuters by the Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jose Vicente Longo on Monday. To end the news, the headlines once again. According to estimates, the Russian Communist Party and the pro-government unity bloc are leading in the results of the parliamentary elections held on Sunday in Russia. And the Russian President Boris Yeltsin has said Moscow and Beijing are determined to oppose all attempts to impose on them a monopolar world. And with the repetition of those headlines, we end the news.
This is your program, Moscow Mailbag. And here's Joe Adamov to answer your questions. Joe, there's an email from Robert Brown. We don't know where he's coming from, but he says EST, so we think it's the east coast of the United States. He says, do you see Russia getting control of mob-like actions taking place throughout your country?
Well, I don't quite understand what you mean by mob-like actions. Our biggest headache today is Chechnya. But Chechnya is war, pure and simple, not a mob-like action. We've had explosions, 2 in Moscow and 2 in other cities, which brought down big apartment houses. But that is terrorism, not mob-like actions. If you mean striking miners, teachers, or other skills and professions, well, show me a country where you don't have that. If you mean contract killings, yes, they're pretty common, unfortunately. Chechnya, or almost all of it, will be taken over by the Russian army. The terrorists, called separatists by the West, will retreat into the mountains and wage a guerrilla war from there. At least that's how I see it. They may attempt to organize some more bombings and terrorist explosions, but so far, so quiet. Touch wood.
Mr. Brown says, I would love to visit your country, but that he feels unsafe.
When these huge explosions took place in Moscow, my friends from pre-war days, now living in Washington, D.C., called to find out if I was okay. I told them no one here panicked, and it was business as usual. There had been explosions in other countries, too, maybe not quite that powerful. The police here were as active as ants in an anthill, seeking for explosives. When I said business as usual, I meant it. So my good friend Robert Brown, I assure you there is no reason whatsoever not to come to this country if you feel like it. I assure you you'll be quite safe. I've not heard from any of my friends here that they feel unsafe. What you should not do is walk around at night in dark alleys or parks. You should not get into cars unless they are provided by your hotel or are authorized taxi cabs. Elementary precautions like that, and you'll be as safe as one could be anywhere. Mind you, I do not work for any travel agency, I assure you.
And those sort of precautions, Joe, are what anybody would have to take anywhere in the world.
Naturally.
Okay, so David Morris from Vienna writes, here in the West, the bear is the symbol of Russia. Can you tell us about the origins of this symbol, he says?
The average Russian does not know that the bear is the symbol of Russia. You're absolutely right. It is a symbol of this country in the West. How it originated in the West, I do not know. You should seek the answer in the place of its origin. Well, I suppose this is only a supposition. It's the size of the country, the endless expanses of virgin land that gave rise to this picture of a huge, untamed, hairy brute. Did you know that in days gone by, gypsies roamed the country here with a tame bear on a leash
a bear that would dance and entertain onlookers. The only unofficial symbol of Russia today is the birch tree. There are several, by the way, right outside my window.
This one comes from Fumito Hokamura from Fukuoka Ken in Japan. This correspondent asks, how many unemployed people are there in Russia, and what measures are being taken to eradicate it?
Today there's something like 9 million unemployed in our country, which is approximately 12% of our workforce. Unemployment is the result of the fact that a huge portion of our economy is at a standstill. I would not be surprised if the actual figure was much higher than the one I quoted. Our unemployed are supposed to receive unemployment benefits, but very few actually do. You may ask why. Because not all register when they lose their job. In some outlying place where, say, the local mines provided the only jobs, their closure, that is, of the mines, leaves everybody unemployed with no chance of finding any job locally. Unemployment will only be eradicated when our economy starts functioning again. When that'll be, is anybody guess?
The correspondent from Japan asks another question. Do you expect any trouble in connection with the oncoming year 2000? He's thinking about power failures and the like.
We know and understand the problem and are doing everything possible in all branches of the economy so that there'd be no major trouble. Much has been done in the field of atomic power stations. We can be sure that there'll be nothing to worry about in that field. I was happy to learn that things will be smooth in all branches of our economy and of our industry. On December 1st, we began checking all branches of transport. What is interesting is that 2/3 of our people do not know what the troubles of the year 2000 are all about. And about 1/3 of the people have a very, very faint idea.
Do you think anybody's storing up food, Joe, for this, whether it will be a disaster or not?
No, there's no panic, and I have not heard or read anything about anybody storing food or anything else.
Okay, from Australia, David Horkoff from Catherine in Northern Territory says, it seems to me that Russian people have been educated for decades to a far higher philosophical level than people in the West, also intellectually and spiritually. Joe, do you believe this is true?
That's a tough question, and I don't know whether you'll agree with what I am going to say. Your words are exactly what Soviet propaganda used to say. Please understand me correctly. It was also said that we are a reading public and whatnot. Today, all these outpourings are taken with a pinch of salt, are quoted with sarcasm. The only way to find out is to take a scientifically based public opinion poll on a mass scale. Then we could compare. Are we philosophically superior? And if so, what is our philosophy? Communism? I have a feeling there are plenty of nuts in all nations, and plenty of very smart people too. We could draw conclusions only if we knew all these facts percentage-wise.
How do Russian people really see the murdering of women and children in Chechnya? That's the latest question.
Public opinion polls show that the overwhelming majority of Russians support the war in Chechnya. Why? Because of the explosions in several Russian cities which carried away hundreds of lives, because the Chechens invaded Russian territory in Dagestan and swore they would set up a Wahhabi North Caucasian Republic, because Chechnya became the center of narcotics trade, because they stole thousands of tons of oil from the pipeline, because they held and still hold no end of people in underground cellars for ransom. In my last program, I asked, what would you do in our place? And Mr. Clinton, several days later, said the same thing. What would we do in their place, he said. I'm not trying to raise myself to Clinton's level. No. In World War II, the Allied Air Force wantonly bombed Germany. Millions of innocent men, women, and children died. During the Vietnam War, there were over a million civilian casualties. Not a word was uttered in their defense. The latest Chechen figure is 4,000 civilians killed. 4,000, not over a million, like in Vietnam. And the world is up in arms against these brutal Russians. Maybe you can tell me how to conduct a war without any civilian losses. The Allies in World War II bombed Dresden, a city that had absolutely no military installations or factories. 300,000 civilians were buried under the rubble. Even the communist Soviet Union said it was uncalled for. Oh yes. How many innocent women and children died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? I was in Nagasaki in 1970. Today, there's a world outcry against the new Russia. Why, may I ask? We're fighting the terrorists, the Wahhabis, the invaders, with unheard of minimum losses, civilian losses, minimum. One of my bosses used to say, Joe, if they want to prove you're a camel, they'll prove it. And that's just what the Western media is trying to do, trying to prove that we're camels.
Joe, from Japan, Hino City, our correspondent Kazuo Kudo says, which foreign country do Russians like best?
Well, if you take the United States, I think they not so much like it. I have a feeling they envy it. Speaking to dozens of ordinary citizens, I've come to the conclusion that they know very little about everyday life and everyday wages in the United States or any other Western country. When you tell them, they stand gaping. A very large number of people still regard the United States as a country where everything is negative. No doubt, a hangover of the Soviet propaganda of the old days. Now, as for Japan, your country, all Russians know the wonderful economic progress your tiny country has made, and I had the pleasure of being there for 7 months. They know that the Japanese work hard and achieve fantastic results.
John Devon from Pasadena in California says there was an undeclared war in 1939 between the Soviet Union and Japan in which Russia was victorious. Our history books don't mention it at all, but it made a big impression on the Japanese, he says, who did not wish to engage the USSR after that. Looking forward to your reply, he says.
A year before that, in 1938, the Japanese invaded Soviet territory near Lake Hassan, not far from Vladivostok on the Pacific. They were intent on testing the strength of the Soviet Union and its military preparedness. Then, in the year that you mentioned, 1939, large Japanese forces invaded the area of Halhin-go, that's a river in the Mongolian People's Republic, with which we had a mutual assistance pact. Both attacks were repelled with heavy losses for the Japanese. John, another thing that is also very little known in the West is that the Soviet Union informed the Allies at the Crimea Conference that 3 months after the termination of the war against Germany, it would enter the war against Japan, which it did, and denounced the Soviet-Japanese neutrality treaty, and true to the obligations to its allies, declared war on Japan. 1.5 million Soviet troops launched an offensive on a 3-mile front, and in 11 days routed the Kwantung Army, Japan's main striking force. Why am I telling you all this? Because that, too, is very little known in the West.
Mr. Linden from Toronto in Canada says, why do Jewish people who emigrate from Russia use Russian last names? Did the Russian government force them to have Russian last names?
A prominent Russian lawyer of Jewish origin, Mr. Seamus, emigrated to the United States and is known in the United States as Mr. Symes. Now, did the United States government force him to Americanize the pronunciation of his name? I doubt it. A lady who worked with me here at Radio Moscow for many, many years and who was born in the United States had a family name that was very hard to pronounce in English. She went back to the States 10 years ago and is now known as Mrs. Tugov. You see, there is a tendency to give one's name a local flavor or to simplify it. My name ends on an OV too, but I'm 100% Armenian. I have no doubt sometime in the dim past, my name was Adamyan, a name common in Armenia. But my grandfather was already Adamov, not Yan. I have, or ever had, two cousins. One of them was called Yedigarov, and the other Yedigaryan. Same papa, same mama.
Ndide Zudia from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia says, is Russia a force to be reckoned with? Can Russia be a threat to the British?
Russia is no threat to anybody, take it from me. As for being a force to be reckoned with, yes, as long as it's a major nuclear power, it is a force to be reckoned with. Don't forget, we still have excellent fighter planes, fighter bombers, and a missile that can evade any anti-ballistic defense. Then our S-300 anti-aircraft missile is known worldwide. And at the end of this year, we'll be getting the S-400, which is ahead of Western anti-aircraft systems by at least 10 years, experts say.
There's another military question here, Joe. Is the Russian Air Force strong enough to defend Russian airspace? The West says the Russian pilots are ill-trained.
I have read that our pilots cannot make, that is those that are in training, cannot make the required number of hours in the air because of a lack of fuel, kerosene, which is used by the jets. There are other troubles too. And then 8 out of 10 planes have served their allotted number of years. But the thing that could improve matters is an influx of money into the industry, and I've learned that more money is being allotted to aviation.
Joe, no more defense questions, thanks. Let's have some wrap-up jokes.
Little Boris asks Mother, Ma, where do baby elephants come from? Only don't tell me that storks bring them, because they're so heavy no stork could ever lift one. A beggar and a newly rich Russian in church. The newly rich Russian says, "Oh Lord, please help me buy a new Cadillac and a villa in the Canaries." The beggar says, "Please, oh Lord, don't let me die of hunger." The newly rich Russian gives him $100 and says, "Here, my friend, take this, and don't distract the Lord with your petty requests."
That was Joe Adamov answering your questions on Moscow Mailbag. Address your questions to Joe Adamov, Voice of Russia, Moscow, Russia. Our email address is letters@vor.ru. I'll repeat that. letters@vor.ru. You couldn't do better than write us that letter, and in it tell Joe what you think of his show.
Voice of Russia World Service. This is the news in brief. As vote counting continued on Monday night after Sunday's parliamentary polls in Russia, the reports issued by the Central Electoral Commission showed that the communists maintained the lead with about 24.2% of the vote. Coming next were the pro-government unity bloc with about 23.3%. Russia and China are full of determination to resist attempts by some countries to create a one-polar world. In an interview with the Chinese television and the official Xinhua news agency, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin said that Moscow and Beijing would campaign for a multipolar world and wage a joint battle against terrorism and separatism. At least 10,000 people were killed as a result of floods and mudslides in Venezuela. The leader of the Russian Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, voiced readiness to cooperate with other parties in the new State Duma, above all with the Fatherland All-Russia bloc. The president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, who headed the OSCE observer mission at the elections to the State Duma, has given a positive assessment of the voting procedure. And that was news in brief.
The Voice of Russia World Service presents Music at Your Request, hosted by Svetlana Yakomenko, a program for all who enjoy hearing classical music. And my individual hellos go out to Leon Post of Beverwick, Holland, Anthony Burley of London, Great Britain, Mayumi Koito of Tokyo, Japan. These lovers of classical music have one aspect in common. They all single out a particular favorite, Chopin. So today's edition of our program we dedicate entirely to the great Polish composer. We shall be hearing his piano music and transcriptions. One of them by Balakirev, I'm sure is unfamiliar to you, while the other is generally loved by many. I'm referring to the ballet Chopiniana by Glazunov, orchestration of Chopin's piano works, made especially so that Chopin's music could be danced to on the stage. Chopiniana in a recording of the orchestra of Moscow's Philharmonic Society, conducted by Dmitry Kitayenko. Now, over to Chopin's original work. The Nocturne in F sharp major, in the rendition of one of the best Russian interpreters of Chopin's music, Heinrich Neuhaus. Nocturne in F-sharp major by Chopin in a recording of Heinrich Neuhaus. The words by the Russian pianist shall be a commentary to the next recording. When in 1936, the most famous ever interpreter of Chopin, Alfred Cortot, toured in Russia, Neuhaus wrote, "One can disagree with him, but one cannot fail to be caught up by his playing. You listen and find yourself under the impression that you're coming into contact with flaming currents, something restless, shimmering, ever-changing, bright, delusive, and yet scorching." End of quote. While I recall the words of French critic Bernard Gavotti, which travel the world over, when Cortot's hands cease to exist, Chopin shall die a second time. A-flat major, opus 69, in a recording of Alfred Cortot. And another very special recording of Russian pianist Emil Gil. Even many connoisseurs familiar with his work do not know this recording. It was made at a concert of the pianist in 1953 in St. Petersburg. At the time, Gil, for the first and only time in his life, played the entire cycle of 24 preludes by Chopin. The concert was a phenomenal success, but Gil never again played all of these preludes together. Why? When asked about this, he said, "I had scored a sonnet, and I had to move onwards." preludes and a recording of Emil Gilul. The finale of today's program is, for a majority or maybe even all of our listeners, a revelation, a totally unknown composition written in the middle of the past century. This is a suite on a theme from Chopin by Balakirev. The Russian composer was a devout admirer of Chopin. He did a great deal to ensure that a monument be opened to the composer in his native Zhelyazova. When the monument was finally unveiled, the concert in honor of the event featured music by Balakirev. To be more exact, Chopin's Mazurkas, Nocturne, Scherzo, an incredibly subtle orchestration by Balakirev. I think it's symbolic that in a year when all across the world events are being held in connection with Chopin, we are rediscovering for ourselves this composition. And with it we end this edition of Music at Your Request.
This is the world service of the Voice of Russia. At 06 hours UTC, we are opening transmissions to Australia and New Zealand in the 13, 16, and 19-meter band short waves. Listeners in Europe can receive us on 227 and 433 meters in the medium waves. Please stand by for the news on the hour and other features.